People with ADHD who are also anxious tend to do better because the anxiety tightens the screw of focus. An awful lot of people with ADHD will use stress in order to focus. But then when you come into menopause, your estrogen levels drop, so do your serotonin and dopamine levels. So you're left with less serotonin, less dopamine, and you're less able to focus and you're more anxious. And that's when you tip into this crisis. And the strategies that you used before no longer work because the biological landscape has changed.
Dr. Judith Mohring is a Cambridge-educated psychiatrist,
medical professional and expert in all things ADHD,
specializing in female hormones.
Her mission is to help ADHD women manage their symptoms better during menopause.
I want to go through hormone by hormone, starting with estrogen. What role does this play in a woman? How is it affected by menopause, and what knock-on effect can this have on a neurodiverse person?
So estrogen, as it drops, you see an impact throughout the body, and particularly in the brain. You see lower levels of dopamine, lower levels of serotonin.
Progesterone?
After the body produces an egg, there's something called the corpus luteum, which is like the leftover bit, and that produces progesterone. For many women, progesterone is calming, but for some women, progesterone is kind of depressing, and so they get premenstrual dysphoria.
Testosterone, how does that play its part?
So testosterone is metabolized to estrogen by aromatization. As women's estrogen levels drop, we also see a drop in their testosterone. And there's some emerging clinical evidence that maybe it really helps with brain fog and clear thinking and energy.
What hormone would be the key villain in that story, and what moods might that hormone be responsible for?
I would say that
Loyal listeners and viewers, I can't thank you enough for tuning in to ADHD Chatter, where we ask world-leading ADHD experts the hard questions to give you access to the most cutting-edge information on the topic. If you've ever felt broken or different, I hope this helps in your search for information, answers, and community. And do you know what would really help me in return? By clicking the follow or subscribe button wherever you're listening. It might not seem like much, but at ADHD Chatter, it means a huge deal. And with this, I can book more incredible guests and keep the self-discovery fire alive for all of us, including myself. Just one click of a button goes a lot further than you think. We'll promise to listen to your feedback and book the guests you want on topics that matter to you. And remember, you're not broken, just different, and you have always been enough. Judith, welcome back.
Thank you, Alex. Good to see you.
Likewise, back by extremely popular demand after your first episode.
Yeah, I maybe want to hide under a chair. I was a bit scared. I'm not used to social media, so it was a bit much. But it was very good. Yeah, really good.
I think 500,000 people listened to it. So an honour to have you back. This time talking about something a little bit more specific, female hormones and the menopause.
Yep.
So I suppose my first question, Judith, is why should someone stick around for the next hour? What will they learn from you about ADHD and menopause?
Right. Well, it's a really exciting area. It's only recently been researched. There's a lack of research. It's emerging. It's the watch this space in female mental health, and it's definitely a watch this space in ADHD because I'm going to call them sex hormones, although they have many, many different functions. They really do interact with neurotransmitters in the brain, particularly those involved in ADHD.
I was researching for this episode. There is quite a lot of information out there on this topic already. I don't know how much of it is true, but from your perspective, what do you think is unique that someone might learn from this conversation today that isn't already out there on the internet?
So I suppose it's the idea that with ADHD and menopause, there's kind of dysregulation squared. So ADHD is very much about dysregulation, too little in the way of neurotransmitter or too little in the way of stimulation or too much. And when we add menopause on top of that, we have dysregulation multiplied by dysregulation. So there's a lot to learn, there's a lot to know. And there are always surprises in menopause and there are always surprises in ADHD. So there's lots to learn.
Fascinating. And I think if we start from the basics, Judith, and then maybe get into the more complex stuff a little bit later on, could you give us an overview in first ADHD in women and how it presents at perimenopause?
Okay, so I'm going to start with ADHD in women because that's important. There was a great summary paper in 2020 by Susan Young and her co-writers talking about how ADHD is missed. So we know it's missed in women, it's underdiagnosed because it presents slightly differently. And in particular, the kind of inattentive symptoms seem more prominent in women and girls. And it seems also likely that women and girls internalize their symptoms a bit more than men and boys. So by internalizing, what we mean is that the symptom is a problem for you, you experience it in your inner world, but it's not necessarily something that other people will see or notice. So there may be masking, it may not be picked up. So it's underdiagnosed. And the other issue is with perimenopause. What happens at perimenopause is very often women who've been coping with their ADHD then can't cope anymore because of the hormonal changes, and also because menopause is kind of like nature's glass ceiling. It happens when everything else in your life is happening. You might be senior in your career, you might have a new health problem, you might have elderly parents, you might have teenage kids. Everything else is going on. There's lots of demand. And at that point, that's when your ADHD symptoms often get worse and you get unmasked.
And just to continue with the basic stuff, Judith, what is perimenopause? What is menopause? And what can a woman expect to face during that period?
I'm really glad you're asking that, because my husband and I once watched a whole documentary about menopause and nobody defined what it was, which is like, actually, it's really fundamental. Menopause is the day 12 months after your last period. It's just one day.
Just one day.
And yet we talk about it all the time, but it's just that one day, 12 months after your period stops. After that day, you're postmenopausal. Before that day, you're in perimenopause. And perimenopause means around the menopause. And it basically is any period of time from sort of 5 to 10 years before your periods actually stop, where your estrogen levels vary and your periods are irregular. And it's like your body's gaslighting you. All these weird symptoms happen. And you get all these sort of strange symptoms that you might not be able to put your finger on to start with.
Fascinating, Judith. And I suppose finally, with the basic questions, how are these two things intertwined, that being menopause and its effect on ADHD women?
Simple takeaway is very straightforward, which is when you go into perimenopause, your estrogen levels drop because you're having fewer ovulatory cycles. So you get estrogen when you ovulate. You have fewer of those cycles until you stop those cycles altogether. And as the estrogen drops, it impacts your brain, because estrogen doesn't just affect sex function, it affects brain function too. So as the estrogen drops, your dopamine also drops. And as your dopamine drops, the inattentive symptoms of ADHD get a lot worse.
I want to go through hormone by hormone. This is a three-part question, really, starting with estrogen. What role does this play in a woman? How is it affected by menopause, and what knock-on effect can this have on a neurodiverse person?
So estrogen is, again, going back to this idea of sex hormones. They're not sex hormones. They're hormones that in fact impact the entire body. So when a girl goes through puberty and she becomes mature, basically, her body changes. So you get changes in sort of how thick the hair is, and you get changes in skin, bone strength, heart, brain. So you get these impacts of estrogen all around the body. And when you go into menopause and your estrogen levels drop, you get these impacts from the loss of estrogen all around the body. And that's how we see the menopausal symptoms. So estrogen, as it drops, you see an impact throughout the body, and particularly in the brain. You see lower levels of dopamine, lower levels of serotonin, lower levels of neurotransmitters as it drops.
And if we were to ask the same question, but for progesterone?
So progesterone is really interesting and really quite complicated. And progesterone is produced by, basically, after the body produces an egg, there's something called the corpus luteum, which is like the leftover bit, and that produces progesterone halfway through the cycle. And for many women, progesterone is calming. And when the period happens and the progesterone drops, you get premenstrual syndrome, you feel anxious. But for some women, progesterone is kind of depressing. And so they get premenstrual dysphoria, and they feel miserable from day 14 to day 28 because they've got higher progesterone. So you have these different impacts of progesterone. But for most women, when they go into perimenopause, because they're having fewer ovulations, they get less progesterone. And that means they're often more anxious. So you see more anxiety. And we also see, because progesterone is metabolized to something called allopregnanolone, that's a word I don't have to say too often, allopregnanolone. It impacts and acts on GABA receptors in the brain. And GABA is where alcohol hits as well. So when you have your period, it's like being hungover because the progesterone's dropping. It's like alcohol being withdrawn. And when you go into menopause, very often people's anxiety goes up. And you see women developing increased patterns of problems with alcohol because they're drinking to reduce anxiety and help with insomnia. So really, this is really complicated, interactions between multiple hormones and behaviors. It's not easy to summarize, but this is the kind of landscape we're looking at.
It sounds like an incredibly confusing time for a woman.
It's a confusing time for doctors, if I'm honest, as well. And this is where I think my journey on this started. I'm obviously a woman who's kind of around menopause. And so my journey on this started looking after patients of a similar age 5, 6, 7 years ago. I educated myself because when I went to see my GP said, you're too young. And then when I was seeing female patients, they were coming in from their doctors and they said, I spoke to my doctor and he rolled his eyes and said, don't talk to me about menopause. It's confusing for doctors and the science isn't that clear. And we see different responses in different women and we don't really know why. And so it's quite, you need really well-trained medical staff to be able to give good advice, and it takes a while to tailor treatments for people.
I want to explore some more of those confusions, Judith, but I think there was just one hormone I wanted to touch on first, and that was testosterone. How does that play its part?
So testosterone is metabolized to estrogen by aromatization. So women have testosterone as well as men. It's not a male hormone. And we know that as women's estrogen levels drop, we also see a drop in their testosterone. So some clinicians will look at prescribing testosterone for women at low doses. It's not licensed in this country, in the UK, but some clinicians do look at prescribing testosterone for women. And there's some emerging clinical evidence that maybe it really helps with brain fog and clear thinking and energy. It is licensed in other countries for enhancing libido, but for brain fog it isn't. So,
and going back to the confusions, I mean, it sounds like a minefield of knowledge to try and digest and consume for anyone. I mean, going through it, it must be a tsunami of different data points pulling you in a different direction. Out of the women you've spoken to, do you see that confusion taking them sometimes to quite concerning places?
So, yeah, it can do. It really can do. A lot of women present at this time of life because their mental health has taken a turn for the worse. 1 in 6 women gets depressed in the perimenopausal period. So we see an increase in common mental health conditions, anxiety, depression, etc. And I think this is where having good education is important, and being aware that things may happen that are quite subtle to start with, but then as the problem grows, it can be a really big problem. So having good education is really important to think, no, this may be perimenopause and it might need addressing.
If we look at the hormone fluctuations, Judith, and we see, like you've explained, that they can have a significant impact on someone's ADHD and their ability to manage it, what hormone would be the key villain in that story, and what moods might that hormone be responsible for?
Oh, I don't like villain. I like to think of it as saviour. So I would say that estrogen would be the kind of knight in shining armour that can turn up on its white horse and make you feel better. And certainly I would love every woman in the UK to be given a health check at 45 and given advice about management of menopause, because estrogen for many women is a useful thing to take at that point to reduce low moods. And we know estrogen is effective as an antidepressant. We've got that evidence. The evidence has been around since the 90s at least. Jayashri Kulkarni in Australia does amazing research, and we just don't use the evidence we have, which is really frustrating. So estrogen is like the saviour. And progesterone can be a villain when you give synthetic progesterones, because we know those can worsen mood, but bioidentical progesterone is better for mood. So progesterone can be really helpful. And obviously, if you're taking estrogen and you have a womb, you need to take progesterone as well to protect the womb from endometrial cancer. So I would say those two are sort of the key players. Testosterone would be a later addition to the scene if that's needed.
And during this time, how can it look for the people that are around the woman coming into this phase of her life? Do you have any advice for them on how to manage such a tempestuous time?
It's a really good question, because it's one that men often ask me. So I do talks on menopause for men, helping men understand this time of life, because it can come with quite a lot of shame and embarrassment. Men don't necessarily like talking about gynecological stuff. And so helping understand it is really important, and also being able to say to your, the people around you, colleagues, friends, family, I know that, this can be a difficult time. Is there anything I can do to help? But I think for families, for families and friends, what's difficult is you can see sometimes a woman really suffering, and not every woman is ready to go and have those conversations. We still see lots of women who are embarrassed to talk about gynecology, or who are not well supported by a good GP, or are concerned about thinking about HRT. Lots of reasons why people have anxieties about addressing this.
We talk a lot, Judith, on this podcast about people getting misdiagnosed with ADHD and often presenting with symptoms of anxiety. or overwhelm, and that takes them to care, that takes them to assessment, and they get diagnosed, maybe misdiagnosed with ADHD. But through the lens of menopause, can there be traits of the menopause or perimenopause that could overlap with ADHD and therefore lead to a misdiagnosis?
Again, that's a really interesting question, because to get a diagnosis of ADHD, you need traits. They need to be lifelong. So they need to be pervasive, and you need to have had them since before the age of 12, and you need a certain number of traits. But you also need to be distressed by the symptoms. So if a woman copes really well throughout her life, and I saw somebody like this today, somebody, you cope really well throughout your life, but you definitely have features of ADHD, but you're not distressed, you don't meet the diagnostic threshold. If, say, at 40 or 45, suddenly you become distressed, now you do meet the diagnostic threshold. So it's not so much misdiagnosis, it's more that now you're actually meeting the diagnostic threshold. And then the question is, what do you do for that woman? Do you prescribe HRT? Do you prescribe an antidepressant for anxiety? Hopefully not. Or do you look at actually a treatment for ADHD? But we see, certainly in the last, I would say, in the past, women were just given antidepressants at this point, or CBT. And neither of those things is going to help with menopause or necessarily ADHD. So it's good that there's awareness now, because I think we should be using kind of the proper, nice guidance to support people's treatment at this point.
Could it be the case that the woman was essentially managing her ADHD? She might not be aware that she has ADHD, but she subconsciously has put scaffolding around herself, and she's put tools and strategies in place to get by and to deal with some of the challenges that come with ADHD. But when the menopause happens, that kind of adds additional stress. The scaffolding kind of wobbles, and that's what enables her or makes it necessary for her to almost not get into a crisis point, but adds that extra ingredient of distress that takes her to assessment.
Totally. Absolutely. I think that's exactly what's happening. And because people with ADHD who are also anxious tend to do better, because the anxiety is like, it sort of tightens the screw of focus, basically. It helps you to focus if you're a bit stressed. So an awful lot of people with ADHD will use stress in order to focus. But then when you come into menopause or perimenopause, as your estrogen levels drop, so do your serotonin and dopamine levels. So you're left with less serotonin, less dopamine, and you're less able to focus, and you're more anxious. And that's when you tip into this crisis where actually you're overwhelmed with anxiety, your mood is low, you can't focus, and the strategies that you used before no longer work because the biological landscape has changed.
A quick word from our sponsors to address a big ADHD issue, the notebook fallacy. We all convince ourselves that buying that one magic notebook will solve all of our problems, but it never does. Nor does the second one, or the third, or the 10th. Well, Tiimo app is more useful than having all the notebooks in the world. And what use are notebooks if you keep losing your pen anyway? Tiimo app has hugely helped me organize my chaotic life by offering the most user-friendly interface an organizational app has to offer. The difference is, it's designed by neurodiverse brains for neurodiverse brains. And you can tell, it's built to adapt to your neurodiverse way of thinking and be flexible to your way of planning. And now it's even more simple with the AI planning assistant. Tiimo now offers an incredible new voice transcribing service, making it even easier to use. A simple voice prompt when you have to plan something or something pops into your mind, and the new AI planning assistant hears it and transcribes it instantly into an easily digestible list of instructions for you to remember. Tiimo is here to help you simplify planning, build focus, and make life happen. No more decision paralysis. The new AI planning assistant makes it so quick and easy to insert information, you can do it before you've forgotten or been distracted. Give it a go and use the link in my bio for 30% off. Just a note though, this code is only applicable on the web browser, not on the smartphone. Then when Tiimo solves all of your problems, go ahead and use your notebooks for something useful, like propping up a wobbly table leg or mopping up a spilt coffee. Back to the episode. Do you know the percentage of women that report to have their ADHD traits worsen as they go into menopause?
There's an attitude survey. So one of the issues we have is there's not much good research. There's very little clinical research. It's almost as if nobody really cares.
Right. Yeah.
For discussion, does nobody care? I think people do now because we realise what a big issue it is. It was an attitude survey from 2023. I think it shows that about 90% of women with ADHD report a worsening of symptoms in perimenopause and menopause.
90%?
I believe that is the statistic, but I should have to check. It's around that, yeah.
So significant.
Yes. And we also know that women without ADHD get symptoms that look like ADHD and respond to stimulants, because there is some clinical research on giving stimulants to women who don't have ADHD, and you see an improvement in their brain fog because it's the same biochemistry. So it's all about dopamine.
Why do you think, Judith, people are talking more about the menopause now? And why do you think they weren't for so long?
Shame, basically. So it's the same reason people talk about mental health more now. So the nice thing about the internet is you can go online. Nobody needs to see where you're going, and you can go and find groups of other people to talk about menopause, weird symptoms, mental health. And that's really positive, I think, that we're much more open than we used to. So we're talking about it more. Also, it affects half the population. Everybody with ovaries will go through the menopause. So yes, it affects half of us.
And can the menopause affect memory? Because I suppose if we all know obviously the ADHD, some of us struggle with short-term memory, and can the menopause or traits of be confusing with the natural traits of ADHD?
Yes. So with ADHD, we find people are forgetful, but they're not usually quite as forgetful as they tend to be. So in menopause, you have sort of quite specific memory problems like difficulty recalling people's names, forgetting what you went into different rooms for. So you do see sort of minor memory problems. They're slightly different from ADHD, but yes, it's very easy to get the two kind of mixed up, and also for the menopause to exacerbate the ADHD symptoms, definitely.
I think for me, it's like in conversation in public, it's that word recall that I struggle with. You say something that I say every day, like a particular train I get, and I'm coming from, sometimes I can forget the city where I live.
Really?
Like the recall of words that I use all the time when I'm in conversation. Maybe there's a bit of social anxiety coming into play there, but yeah, the recall memory issue is big for me.
Yes, so that grip thing where you can't quite grip the thing that you want to get. Yeah.
And then you think of it, you leave the social situation, you're going maybe for a wee in the bathroom, and it comes to you.
Yes.
It's like, I wish I knew that 2 minutes ago when it was the perfect witty thing to say.
Yes. Well, I remember when I realised I was perimenopausal because a friend who I'd known for about 6 years came into the kitchen. I tried to introduce her to someone else. And I'm like, I cannot remember your name. And she looked at me and went, I'm Andrea. I'm like, I know. She couldn't remember her name. So that was a real pain.
It is quite shame-inducing because then you genuinely feel like that person feels like you're stupid, even though this is really basic stuff that you do know, but just in that moment, you just couldn't recall it from the part of the brain that it is, and you feel like you looked really silly in that social setting.
Yes, I've discovered something about feeling stupid, which is actually, it's a real gift to be allowed to do that. So I'm in group therapy at the moment, which I absolutely love. And one of the great things about group therapy is you reduce shame because you're talking about things that are difficult with people who you trust. And it's just a joy to be able to sort of embrace feeling a bit stupid and not knowing stuff, particularly after years of having to be an expert and trying to know things. It's like sometimes it's really good just not to know stuff. Anyway, that's my secret. I'm actually really stupid.
An exclusive on the ADHD Chatter. Judith Mohring admits.
Well, I certainly feel stupid half the time, when you just like can't remember things or lose things or forget things or.
It's interesting. I do a lot of talking on stage and I get a question and that happens. I actually am just quite honest now and say, I'm going to have to come back to you in 5 minutes because I can't think of the answer to that. It's always fine.
I think people quite like it when we're honest, when people are honest and go, I can't remember at the moment, sorry.
Yeah, I've never ever had a negative response to that.
No.
Whereas I was so scared that I would. Like someone throws a tomato at me when in fact they're just, fair enough, come back to it. And there's a lot of empathy, I feel like, towards someone who is vulnerable like that on stage or when you are in a social setting. It
kind of brings me on to what probably the last question about menopause and what it teaches you. Because I think in menopause you are very vulnerable. You kind of are made vulnerable because very often you have your mental health falls to bits. But that's one of the things it teaches you. It helps you to realise that you can be vulnerable, you can ask for help, you can be supported, you can reach out to other people. And I think that for me has been the gift of menopause, is to sort of learn through this whole process of bits falling off, sticking them back on, the insomnia, the anxiety, the not being, you can't drink alcohol anymore, you get indigestion, it's all a pain in the neck, literally. But you kind of come through and think, I've experienced vulnerability, but from that's where we often find our strength, I think.
Speaking about vulnerability, is there a chain reaction that can occur when the menopause strikes? In other words, a person feels more overwhelmed due to the hormonal fluctuations, which then leads to emotional dysregulation, which then leads to lashing out, which then leads to shame, for example.
Yes. So because the brain's so complicated, like I think of it as being like space. So the brain is more complicated than space. And so when we try and summarize it, we inevitably get it, it's like, it's we can't summarize it, but it's many cycles, many cascades of things that occur very rapidly in the blinking of an eye, literally. And you get these cascades, emotional cascades, where an emotion then triggers a thought, triggers a behavior. And what we tend to find in all mental health is that stability breeds stability, instability breeds instability. So when you have changes in a system, the system has to adapt, and that leads to a degree of dysregulation. And so we see, in more emotional volatility, lack of sleep, which worsens the emotional volatility, which worsens the impulsivity, which worsens the lashing out. So you definitely see these spirals, shame spirals. And when people feel better, and are kind of coming out the other side, we see the kind of rebuilding of stability in the system.
How about one's ADHD distractibility? Would this increase due to hormone fluctuations caused in menopause?
I guess it could. I think pretty much. I mean, I call it, ADHD squared, because it is literally the symptoms of menopause are very similar to ADHD, and so you're kind of squaring your symptoms. So yes, there's no reason why it shouldn't increase. And it's not just ADHD squared; maybe it's ADHD cubed, because you've also got all the physical symptoms of menopause. So the bone pain, the tingling, the weakness, the weight gain, all the physical symptoms as well of menopause. So it's like ADHD cubed.
Right.
There we go.
I read somewhere, Judith, in a study, someone said, I never experienced rage or brain fog before perimenopause. Can menopause cause rage in a person who didn't necessarily have that as a personality trait prior?
Definitely seen it. Yes, quite a lot of people describe kind of bouts of rage, and we get unusual symptoms in perimenopause. This is what I mean about it's like your body gaslighting you. Things that you didn't know were a real symptom. So my fingers swelled up, my joints were big. It's like, what is that? I was incredibly dizzy. My doctor thought I had a brain tumor. It was just perimenopause. So yes, weird symptoms. That's perimenopause all over. So rage, definitely. Yeah. And some women actually also report increasing libido, which can be really problematic due to kind of hormonal variation. So I've had some women come up and talk about that and say, this is really difficult. What do I do? So,
in terms of that being problematic, do you mean them? You're talking about infidelity and affairs happening?
I think for some women, some infidelity, but also this kind of inappropriate feelings towards colleagues, things that they were not expecting in kind of midlife when you're, working in a paper company in Slough, for instance.
If anyone's listening in Slough, then keep your chin up.
Absolutely. Beware, residents of Slough.
Yeah, watch out for menopausal women.
On the prowl.
Yeah. Another person, Judith, said that overwhelm was life-altering, and apparently that is true of 70% of ADHD women going through menopause, which is a strong way to describe it. Would you say that's true of your experience working in the community?
Yep, definitely. So this is where the intersection gets really interesting, because when we do our menopause talks and go into businesses and talk about menopause, just menopause on its own in organisations, and we see that I think 900,000 women, it can't be a year, but there's a statistic about the number of women who leave employment due to menopausal symptoms. And people that tend to think of menopause as like hot flushes, sweats, insomnia, it's the mental health symptoms that are the big ones. Those are actually the big ones. And there was a study last year from the University of Edinburgh that described the mental health impact of menopause and neurodiversity is huge, particularly in the workplace. So people are overwhelmed enough that they're leaving work. They're having to have time off. They're changing jobs. They can't cope. And this is definitely what I have seen in clinic as well, as women coming completely overwhelmed with the demands of midlife and hormonal variation.
And how can a woman manage these fairly vicious symptoms and help ease them?
So there's lots of ways. I suppose the first things are obviously speak to your GP, obviously think about HRT if that's appropriate for you and you want to go down that avenue, because definitely estrogen can help with all sorts of psychological and physical symptoms of menopause. If you don't have an ADHD diagnosis, then it might be worth trying to pursue one. If you haven't previously needed ADHD medication, you might want to think about it. And then beyond that, it's the other things as well. And obviously I'm very much into the other things, the psychoeducation, the group work, the getting together, the talking, the sharing. the learning about what's going on, so that when your body does throw up a new symptom, you don't think, oh my goodness, I've got a brain tumor. You think, actually, this is probably perimenopause. And then on top of that, the things that really help, exercise is key. Weightlifting is really good in menopause because weight gain is an issue. But when you have bigger muscles, actually your metabolic rate is higher. Looking at your diet's important. It's a great time to give up drinking. I know you don't drink, do you?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I've pretty much given up myself because it just is it's a fool's game at this point. I can't manage it. It doesn't help anyone. So it's a good time to have a kind of lifestyle overhaul if you can. And also sometimes taking a break from work. For me, it's been a time when I've pulled back from work for 3 or 4 years and worked differently. Not everybody can afford to do that. Not everybody can manage that. But it's certainly, you can talk to your employer about this because they generally have policies in place for menopause.
Just thinking about the sort of the traits of the menopause that might come up if someone puts a search query into Google.
Yeah.
But from your experience and working with your community, have you noticed any very niche, unusual traits that are to do with the menopause that might not show up in a Google search?
So I'm glad you asked this. I looked up symptoms of the menopause at the Menopause charity, a UK-based charity. They came up with 100. But from a brief straw poll of friends, we came up with some other ones, one of which was a friend whose feet burn at night. She wakes up and she feels like her feet are actually on fire.
Okay. Gosh.
Which is weird. I found that my choice of jokes changed. So I began to tell what I can only describe as dad jokes, which is really weird.
What's your favourite dad? Don't want to put you on the spot. What's your favourite dad joke?
Why did the baker have green hands?
Why did the baker have green hands?
Because he needed a pee.
He needed a pee.
Sorry, it's bad, isn't it?
You must be going through the menopause.
That's it. It's dad jokes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That is it, yeah.
What do you call poison underpants?
Poison underpants?
Yeah.
No idea.
Arsenickers.
Arsenic.
Sorry. I have a teenage son. Anyway.
Loads of people at Christmas doing the crackers are going to think,
exactly.
shit, I'm going through menopause.
It's dad jokes.
The obvious symptoms, I suppose, are like overwhelm, procrastination, bad time management, brain fog, memory issues. How can hormones affect a person in this way, like time management, for example?
It's just executive function, really. It's basically executive function is the top bit of the brain. So it's our prefrontal cortex, the bit that's behind the eyebrows. That's where your executive function and your central executive network begins there and then spreads elsewhere in the brain. And that part of the brain is the most vulnerable to changes. So, if you've got a fever or post-COVID, you feel brain foggy, that's because your prefrontal cortex is knocked off. And when we exercise or we're physically well, we feel brighter and sharper because our prefrontal cortex is well supported. So basically, changes in hormonal networks, in hormones and neurotransmitters, which interact with each other, they impact the prefrontal cortex and they reduce our executive function, which makes time management harder. And the thing about executive function is everybody has a different strength and weakness. So even in ADHD, you'll see some people for whom time management's not a problem and others who are really time blind. Some people for whom sequencing is a problem, for others it isn't. So it's working out which bits of executive function are tough for you.
And if we take everything into account, Judith, that we've said in this fascinating conversation, what would you define as the sort of the light at the end of the tunnel, and what advice would you give someone to navigate them towards that light?
So there is some real light at the end of the tunnel, and actually one of the interesting things is that after menopause, you're more like a man hormonally because you have stable hormone levels.
Right.
So you've either kind of come through without HRT and you've got low estrogen, but it's stably low, or you've come through with HRT and you've got stable estrogen and progesterone, but it's stable. You don't get this month in, month out variation. You don't get the premenstrual syndrome, the premenstrual dysphoria, or any of that. So that's nice to know that week in, week out, you'll have the same hormonal landscape. And then the other issue actually is that I think menopause is a great teacher, that you come through older and wiser, older and wider, as people often say, because there's that weight gain. But you come through and I feel you no longer give a shit about so many things. You're not so bothered. And the experience, I think, is quite profound, actually, on lots of levels, because you've been experienced a sort of small breakdown in many ways and a change in your landscape. But it's a very positive one for a lot of women. So that's what I would say. There is light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah,
it's not all
fascinating.
bad.
So fascinating. Thank you so much. I know 85% of people that listen to this podcast are female.
Yeah.
I know it's a highly sought after and in-demand topic. So on behalf of everyone listening, thank you very much.
Thanks.
I want to draw attention to your ADHD item,
Oh, yes.
which is hiding underneath this cloth every week, Judith. And you've done this before. Your item before was the pinata. Yes.
Yes.
Your pinata represented ADHD last time because, and talking about memory issues, you're going to have to remind me why you're...
So it's to do with dopamine. So I shall link it to dopamine in a minute with my new item.
Yes, I'm going to introduce
It's all
your
dopamine.
new ADHD item.
Oh, the lights have gone down. No, these are Pez dispensers. You remember these from childhood?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they should contain, so this one here is, I can't remember if it's Chase or Sky from Paw Patrol. This one here's got little sweeties in it that pop out. There we go.
Very nice.
Oops, there we go. And this one is empty.
Yeah, okay.
And the reason I talk about Pez dispensers is because somebody with ADHD has lower background dopamine.
Yes.
So you are asked to do something boring, you get no reward. Whereas someone without ADHD, do a boring task, Alex. Complete a boring, I don't know, what's boring for you?
Gosh, what's boring for me? Emptying my laundry, doing my accounts.
Doing your accounts. So doing your accounts, if you don't have ADHD, you get a reward, a sense of achievement at the end of that. You get a little kind of dopamine. I'm going to eat this.
Yeah, I'm going to have this one.
So you've had that one. You get a little dopamine
How
reward.
long have I been in there for?
Actually, only about a week.
Yeah, okay.
But if you have ADHD, there isn't any dopamine in your Pez, so you get no reward, which is why it's really hard to do boring things. So that's lower background levels. We
Right,
think
yeah,
that the
makes sense.
neuroscience is low background levels, so the empty Pez, low background levels of neurotransmitters. But because you've got low background levels, you're very sensitive to dopamine. So actually, you're always looking for dopamine in the environment. And there are things like pinatas, things that are really stimulating. So what would be something really stimulating for you?
Oh, going for a run.
Going for a run. Yeah. Okay.
With Eminem playing in my ears.
Okay. Does that give you a real kind of...
Yeah, it gets me in the mood.
Gets you in the
me
mood.
Pumped.
Gets you pumped. Yeah. So that's a nice pinata, something you look forward to doing. It gives you a buzz. It gives you a dopaminergic reward. So that's basically the idea that if we think of neurotransmitters as sweets, then those of us with ADHD have an empty sweet dispenser, but we can still find pinatas full of reward. And that can be good if it's exercise and bad if it's addiction or work or hyperfocus or causes a problem. So that's the Pez and pinata. There you go.
You just solved ADHD management.
I'm not sure I've solved it, but
People are spending a fortune on books and courses. They just need to buy 2 Pez dispensers.
I need to, and a
For the
pinata.
visual.
You
Yeah.
need a pinata.
And a pinata, yeah.
And a tide table, but I did the tides last time.
You did, yes.
Yeah. No, so it's all about either end of the spectrum. There's either too much or too little.
Yeah.
There you
Fascinating.
go.
Thank you, Judith.
I should put
yeah,
those
sure.
there for you.
I want to do the ADHD agony aunt, which is called the washing machine of woes, because as you will remember, my item is a washing machine because I
Oh,
always
yes, it is, isn't it?
leave my clothes in the machine.
What,
after
till they go
cycle.
mouldy?
I haven't got that bad yet, but normally
You
the
should
smell
try.
of damp is
2
what
days.
reminds me. Is it 2 days? Is that
Maybe
the-
3.
Yeah. Well, luckily I walked past my laundry room, so the smell of damp kind of reminds me before it gets to that level. But the Tiimo app, which is the sponsor of the show, is also
Yeah.
very helpful, and we're getting a lot better.
Does it remind you?
Yeah, like pings and yeah. This week, Judith, in the washing machine of woes, someone has written in and asked, I'm going through menopause as an ADHD woman, and no matter how hard I try, I just can't help losing my temper with my husband, and it must be terrible for him. But he winds me up with the smallest thing. What can I do to help this marriage last? Gosh,
Okay.
that
Well,
sounds like a real crisis.
it does sound like a bit of a crisis. The pressure's on, isn't it?
Go.
Go. Okay. Marriage
Save the
Guidance
marriage.
101. Save the marriage. I think she needs to tell him how annoying he's being and that she's got a shorter fuse and ask him to give her a bit more space because I get the sense that she does not like losing her rag. And it might be worth looking at, are they distributing the household chores fairly? Because very often women who coped fine with life when they get to menopause go, you know what, I can't actually carry the same load. So maybe he could help her a bit more around the house. And she in return could say, I'll do some mindfulness or meditation or some exercise. Exercise is brilliant for rage. So going for a walk, joining a group where she does some exercise with friends, something like that might reduce some of that short-temperedness. And the joy of any kind of mindfulness or meditation is, and it doesn't have to be sitting still, you can do it when you're walking or exercising, is it gives you the ability to just pause before you respond. Even if, the other thing is time yourself out. So you know how with toddlers, we put them on the stairs and time them out.
Yes.
If I'm going to lose my rag, I'll time myself out, walk out the room. Just going to take myself outside for a little word, which helps.
Does I think we spoke about this in our first episode, RSD, rejection sensitive dysphoria. Does that come into the equation here? Because you said tell your husband how annoying he is, but if he has ADHD or he kind of snaps back, if you like RSD could blow this up, right?
Well, it could. But I think that's the situation where actually a little bit of honesty might be called for, that both of you may be quite sensitive. But if we can't be honest in a relationship, that's not helpful. So, it's difficult. And sometimes it takes one or other of the pair to go off and have a bit of therapy to work out what's really triggering them, what's really making them feel more emotional. But I think if you can come at it from a place of kind of trust and, if you've been married for a while, yes, you've got skin in the game. You've been doing this for a while. And so there's a reason to want the relationship to continue. So you're jeopardizing it if you're not honest.
Do you think without honesty and without awareness of menopause and RSD, you mentioned earlier, sometimes you can get increased libido plus perhaps an increase in irritability and all this sort of stuff. It all seems like the perfect pressure cooker for almost marriages to end sometimes. Do you see menopause being a trigger sometimes for breakdowns in marriages?
Yeah, so Rod Stewart talked a lot, and his wife talked a lot about the impact of her menopause on their marriage because she had a really tough time. He didn't know what it was. And I think, many marriages go through a tough time at this point because the person who you married is changing. And that can sometimes mean when a woman emerges from menopause, you might think, I no longer will put up with this behavior, or the husband might think, actually, you've changed and I'm not sure the relationship's the same. So either way, it's a period of change. It's a time of change. So yes, it's a time of instability for some relationships. Yeah.
Just finally, Judith, I want to deliver you a letter that was written by the previous guest.
Okay.
I'm going to deliver you, Judith, a letter that's written by the previous guest where they wrote their 3 rules to live by.
3 rules to live by?
3 rules to live by.
Okay, can I read them?
Yes, please.
Okay, 3 rules to live by. Find something you love and enjoy and gives you purpose in life, preferably something you can do for work. I love that. Don't underestimate yourself. You have so much more than you realise. Take a proactive, lifelong approach to your physical and mental health. Those are fabulous.
Amazing.
Who are those from?
Those were from Dr. Joe Perkins,
They're really good. Love them. Yeah.
Amazing. And I'll kindly ask you to do your 3 rules, Judith, as we finish. But on behalf of everyone who is going to be experiencing, or has experienced menopause, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.